Excellent. Thank you, and welcome to Dissidents and Dictators, Human Rights Foundation's conversation series where we expose dictators, discuss global human rights issues, and brainstorm how to put human rights at the top of the global agenda. I'm Jenny Wang, and I am the Manager of Asia Programs and Policy here at the Human Rights Foundation. As a brief overview, HRF is an international, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based in New York City, and we are dedicated to promoting and protecting human rights in countries under authoritarian rule. HRF's initiatives fall under three main pillars. 1, amplifying activist voices. 2, connecting activists with individuals from various industries. And 3, publishing reports, letters, and op-eds to inform the public about the importance of human rights. Today's topic, countering China's transnational repression, is one that we believe is very pressing. As we all may know, China is ruled by a fully authoritarian regime where the rule of law, transparency, and government accountability are severely lacking. There are no free and fair elections, and there is no independence between the different branches of government. Fundamental human rights and civil liberties are not respected, and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, cracks down on dissent in a very systematic and a very calculated way. The CCP's human rights abuses range from censorship to forced labor, concentration camps, arbitrary detentions, religious repression, educational interference, to cultural suppression, violent crackdowns on peaceful pro-democracy movements, and even genocide. The list of abuses goes on. And alarmingly, it has become increasingly clear that China's authoritarian policies are no longer just an internal matter inside China. The Chinese government goes to extreme lengths to silence criticism and instill fear among Chinese, Uyghur, Hong Konger, Tibetan, Taiwanese, and religious communities abroad. And such transnational repression is a very common tactic used by authoritarian regimes globally, and thus the CCP's transnational repression is a threat to all democracies and requires immediate action and immediate attention from the international community. For today's conversation, we're so grateful to be joined by young frontline activists from the Hong Kong community, Tibetan community, and Uyghur community to discuss the Chinese government's various methods of monitoring, of surveilling, and of intimidating dissidents abroad. We have Joey Siu, who is a Hongkongese-American human rights activist who played a key part in the 2019 protests in Hong Kong. We also have Tenzin Yangzom, who is a campaign manager of Students for a Free Tibet, SFT, which is a global grassroots chapter-based organization dedicated to advocating to advance freedom in Tibet. And we also have Zumretay Arkin, who is a Uyghur-Canadian activist, and she is the program and advocacy manager of World Uyghur Congress. The World Uyghur Congress is an international umbrella organization dedicated to promoting Uyghur human rights. Joey, Tenzin, Zumretay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for having us.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you. Well, to kick off this discussion, the first question I have here is open to all the panelists here to answer. The first question is, how would you define transnational repression? I guess we'll go alphabetical. Joey, would you like to go first?
Sure. Again, thank you so much, Jenny, and then also the team at the Human Rights Foundation for coordinating and making this important conversation happen. And thank you so much, Zumretay, and also Yangzom for sharing the stage with us. So in short, I would say transnational repression is an act of governments reaching across borders in an attempt to silence and oppress dissidents, exiled pro-democracy actors among the diaspora through different tactics. And for the textbook definition, according to the FBI, any act of stalking, intimidation, or assault by a foreign government against an individual here in the United States can be considered an act of transnational repression locally here in the States. And it is also seen as an illegal activity that violates individual rights and freedom. And as I have said, it can happen in many, many forms, including stalking, harassment, assault, or even attempted kidnapping, asset freezing, and more. And to talk about the context of the People's Republic of China, the PRC's transnational repression campaign against pro-democracy dissidents overseas, it also often occurs in the forms of forcing or coercing the targeted individual to return to China, threatening or detaining when the targeted individuals on the ground family members or significant others, forcing them to return to China or to commit other intended activities. And it also very often happen in the forms of online disinformation or defamation campaigns. And to talk about all these activities, we also have to note that it can be executed by not just state-controlled or state-affiliated agents, but then it can also occur under the cases of execution by coerced non-community members or community members, or also extended branches of the PRC, including, for example, in the case of Hong Kong, like the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices all around the world. And increasingly, we are also seeing non-state affiliated actors committing to what we to acts of transnational repression, and then also increasingly, especially for the case of Uyghurs, which I believe Zumretay can elaborate even a bit more, that we are also seeing collaborative transnational repression tactics with coordinated efforts from two or more autocratic regimes, for example, between the PRC government and also the Turkish government, etc.
Thank you, Joe. Go ahead, Tenzin, Zumretay, whoever would like to go next.
Yeah, I think Joey has really, defined the term really perfectly. But I think something that I would also add is that most often these governments, these authoritarian governments, are also using international bodies such as Interpol, for example. In the case of Uyghurs, this is something that we've seen repeatedly, where the Chinese government has used Interpol Red Notice, frequently to target dissidents who are living abroad, and to really try to block not only their advocacy efforts but also their own personal life. Whether, because with an Interpol Red Notice, it really limits a lot of things in your personal and professional life, because you're always stopped at borders and questioned, interrogated, detained, and then you're also limited in your capacity to not only travel but also exchange money. So really, these governments use the existing international systems to target actively dissidents, activists abroad. And I think from the victim's perspective, in this case, I would say, for the Uyghur community, transnational repression is something that we live with on a daily basis. Whether you're an activist or not, you are at risk of, for example, hostage diplomacy practices that are exerted on these different families, to basically threaten your relatives who are still living inside, East Turkestan, Tibet, Hong Kong, to really reach you so far. So for Uyghurs, and for victims in general, transnational repression means that you don't feel safe anywhere, wherever you are, even if you're living in democratic states, in freedom. It means that there's always going to be a way for the Chinese government to get you, or for authoritarian governments to get you.
Thank you, Julie and Zumretay. The Chinese government's long arm is truly alarming, and Tenzin, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you define transnational repression as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny, and everyone else for being here. I think my colleague Dendor puts it best. He calls it repression without borders. And this kind of happens when China is able to use their power and social standing, which the international community is able to contribute and does so, to harass and intimidate activists and groups. And actually any opposing voice in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be an activist or group. And this especially comes at a time where China has increasingly strengthened their iron fist on Tibetans inside Tibet at a rate which we haven't seen in a very long time. They have total surveillance on Tibetans inside Tibet, and now they're also increasing their hand by continuing to build up their power overseas through intimidation tactics and more. And I think every Tibetan activist in exile has probably felt in one way or another a form of this transnational repression, whether it be really extreme measures or even just slight intimidation tactics. And actually, we've all, I think, Joey, Zumretay, and I have all unfortunately had our fair share of experiencing some forms of transnational repression together, unfortunately, as well.
All of you have experienced transnational repression, and you guys aren't even inside China. This is why this is so incredibly alarming. I'm curious to learn more. How do these threats of transnational repression differ from those that are currently inside China's borders? What are the experiences of those in exile and those in the diaspora regarding transnational repression?
I can begin first, maybe. So I think when inside of the borders of China or inside of the Chinese Communist Party controlled regions, we are seeing a lot of repression and also crackdown coming in direct forms of, from, for example, police, for example, law enforcement, the police department, and also other government stakeholders inside of China and also CCP controlled regions. But then when it comes to transnational repression, we are seeing a lot of manipulation of different international mechanisms, for example, including what Zumretay just mentioned, the Interpol system, and then also a lot of other international organizations, mechanisms, and also systems. And when it comes to and when it comes to transnational repression, we're also seeing a lot of the use of different coerced non-community members, community members, state-affiliated actors, and then also state coerced actors enforcing and executing the transnational repression schemes against pro-democracy dissidents in exile through a lot of indirect forms, including, for example, family intimidation, anonymous online harassment, defamation, etc., etc. So I would say this is one of the most significant features that we are recognizing in terms of the differences of on the ground repression and also currently overseas transnational repression.
Yeah, just to add on to what Joey has mentioned, I think we've seen this trend within all of our communities, and that's using the security of those still inside, East Turkestan, Tibet, Hong Kong, China, against us, whether it be the relatives we know, relatives we may not know. All of this using visa as a bait to get information from people. I think that is all kind of attributes to the control and power that they're able to seek because they're ultimately holding these people hostage. And so, we would never do anything that would put these people necessarily at risk. So that creates a lot of, difficult spaces to navigate in exile.
Yeah, I think the Chinese government has successfully, led these efforts for many years. Transnational repression is nothing new. It existed in the 90s. It existed, before this. But I think in the recent years, what we've seen is that they have doubled down on their efforts to, I guess, aggressively target families. Outside of dissidents and activists, just regular families, regular people who are living abroad, using their relatives who are still living inside. So that connection, I think, has really been useful to the government, and I think for many years, I think the Uyghur community in the diaspora have stayed silent, or many people have stayed silent in the diaspora community because of that fear of retaliation against their relatives, with that fear of not being able to receive a visa to visit family. But what's interesting in our case is that after in the past few years, we've seen with the emergence of the camps and the crimes against humanity, the genocide, what the government has proven is that actually, whether you're an activist or not, if you speak up or not, your silence is not going to protect you. And I think in our case, that was a bit liberating, because then people realize that they could actually do something. They could speak up, because whether they did it or not, that wouldn't necessarily protect their family. So I think this is also something interesting that we have observed in the past few years.
Thank you. These are good observations, and thank you all so much for sharing your insights. I think, Zumretay, what you mentioned, that transnational repression is definitely something that is not new. Zumretay, I actually have a question. I wanted to expand on what you mentioned earlier about Interpol Red Notice, and I know that the World Uyghur Congress does a lot of work in the UN. How has the Chinese government suppressed international response on its own human rights abuses abroad and to the Uyghur people and to Tibetans and Hong Kongers, etc.?
Yeah, so in the past few years, there's been increased awareness about the issue, and there's been increased condemnation by the international community, including states, international bodies like the Yuan, EU institutions. But despite that, China still to this day denies that these, crimes against humanity, these atrocity crimes are not taking place in the region. They're still defending their policies, genocidal policies, in the name of the right to development, which they're trying to, promote and defend at the UN, especially with the support of global South countries. So it's become this kind of, global North versus the global South values, and China is leading the global South countries with these values of, right to development, right to poverty alleviation, right to exchange, and all of these values have become now universal values in the eyes of China. So until this day, at the UN or elsewhere, the Chinese government is still defending these policies in the names of these values, and they're still basically proclaiming that there is ethnic harmony, unity in the region, in China overall, and yeah, just denying the facts.
Joey or Tenzin, would you like to add on with anything?
No, I'm all set. Thanks.
I know there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about China's use of AI, of technology. How is the Chinese government using this technological prowess to advance its transnational repression efforts?
I think most commonly we have witnessed a lot of online, very, very apparently orchestrated by the Chinese Party, the online disinformation and and then also defamation campaigns. We are also seeing a lot of these harassments and also personal attacks that are clearly driven by the PRC government against pro-democracy dissidents, against diaspora communities. And I'm sure that both me, Sumritai, and also Yangzom here experience to a certain extent that kind of harassment coming from state affiliated actors or state influence actors online on platforms like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and then also a lot more. And then with the advancement and popularity that we are seeing with platforms like TikTok and then also Weibo, we are seeing a lot of these propaganda and disinformation campaign that are systematically coming out from PRC related sources against our diaspora communities. And not to mention that with the technological advancement of these platforms and also development of China's influence in these areas, we're also seeing that they have been exporting these disinformation in regards to our pro-democracy campaigns, etc. And of course, we are seeing a increasing level of surveillance against not just high-profile pro-democracy dissidents who are currently in exile, but then against our diaspora communities as a whole with communication tools like WeChat and also a lot more. So I think all these are very clear reflections of the PRC government's use of technological powers to export the transnational repression against our communities.
Yeah, and to add on to that as well, especially about TikTok, and also there are huge tech giants that are like Thermo Fisher who are being complicit and ultimately ignoring and helping fuel the CCP's agenda of building the largest police database in the entire world, where they'll have access and be able to help map out exactly who is related to who in the diaspora, which is as dangerous as it sounds. And I think there also needs to be a more structured system of reports of incidents so that we can have people report these incidents in a private and, of course, most importantly, in a safe manner. I know, even just as a quick example, my younger sister goes to university in Massachusetts, and she started up a local SFT chapter with a couple of her friends. And they had a fair day where they had like free Tibet stickers and posters, and some Chinese student dressed in a massive dragon came over and started dancing and knocked around their entire billboard and table, and that left them, my sister and her friends, all extremely startled. And that's just one small example of something like that happening in in our own cities, in our own states. And I think that can sometimes really demotivate or scare young Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers into thinking twice before they're vocal or active, which would be a huge disservice to all of our communities and movements. So, we really need to find a way to respond to these incidents better and also provide more support when this does happen to our own community members.
Yeah, and if I may, I think when it comes to talking about the Chinese Communist Party's online disinformation and defamation campaign against our diaspora community members, I think a lot of times when we hear that, we underestimate the level of attack and also harassment that is happening. So I would just say that, so for example, when we hear about these online disinformation and defamation campaigns, we might think that it might just be a few messages coming to us on Twitter. But then I would say the level and then also the scope of these campaigns are really so sophisticated that it's really beyond our imagination. So I would just use the case of a Chinese Australian journalist, Vicky Xu, as an example. So some of our listeners here might be aware of the case that happened against Vicky. I would say it was a year or a little more than a year ago. So because of Vicky's report and also very in-depth research into the Uyghur forest labor, she was targeted by the Chinese state, and they launched a full-on defamation and slander campaign against her, where she had her image being photoshopped with the use of AI technology on some videos, accusing her of a very complicated sexual life, etc. And then they have also made use of the AI technology to do very similar campaigns against a few other journalists of Han Chinese dissident who have been also reporting on the Uyghur genocide, on the CCP's colonization of Tibet, and also the Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. And the scope that we are talking about is not just a few comments on Twitter or a few comments coming in on Instagram or Facebook. It was really a full-on campaign where you all of a sudden you see Vicky's name trending on Twitter on platforms like Weibo overnight, and you see all these information about her and all these fake generated videos of her spreading on Twitter in a unimaginable speed. So I think when we talk about these online harassment attacks and defamation campaigns and disinformation campaigns, we really need to note the scope of these campaigns and understand that the scope is really way beyond our imagination.
If I can just quickly add to that, is also the defamation campaigns that are, led by the Chinese government officials. So, for example, we have instances of government officials at a high level, including spokesperson of the foreign ministry or the government, defaming camp survivors, Uyghur, Kazakh, Kyrgyz camp survivors, and basically publishing their private, confidential medical record to the international community. So these instances are very serious, and I think there hasn't been any appropriate response by the international community. This includes the UN, women, UN bodies, and so I think this is something that we have to understand, as Joey said, in order to be able to give appropriate responses.
Thank you. Yeah, at the Human Rights Foundation, we fully understand and recognize how how alarming transnational repression is. And we also know that dictators learn from each other. I'm curious to learn and see if you guys have noticed if other dictatorships or other authoritarian regimes are taking notes and essentially learning from the CCP with their usage of transnational repression.
I think what we've observed at the World Uyghur Congress is that so the Interpol Red Notice has been misused by China, but that also extends to many other governments, including Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, UAE. So all of these authoritarian governments have used Interpol, to their advantage, to silence activists, to silence dissidents who are living abroad and who are advocating for their rights, for the rights of their people and their communities. So this practice has been, I suppose, learned. They've learned this practice from each other. So yeah, definitely, this is one thing that we have observed.
Yeah, just adding on to what Zumretay already mentioned very, very quickly, I think we are definitely seeing a replicated pattern between the different autocratic regimes' tactics of transnational repression. We see that in the PRC's context, we have been witnessing a lot of use of hostage diplomacy, the threatening and coercing of targeted individuals to return to China, the tactic of holding their family members and significant members back home hostage and forcing them to do to take actions that the PRC wanted them to take in return of their family members' safety. And we also see that, for example, for the case of PRC, we see that the kidnapping of former bookseller Gui Minhai, and we see very similar tactics employed by the Iranian regime in regards to the attempted kidnapping and assassination of the very prominent activist and journalist Masi. And then we are seeing a lot of other autocratic regimes, as Zumretay have mentioned, including Saudi Arabia, Belarus, Turkey, etc., employing very similar tactics against dissidents and opposition voices who are currently in exile, and then also organizing all these pro-democracy movements overseas. And we actually see that. I think it was in a report released by Freedom House very recently. We see that the top 10 countries of the top 10 origin countries of transnational repressions are namely including China, Belarus, Iran, Turkey, Russia, etc. And we see that from all the cases that are in relation to all these autocratic regimes, we see very similar patterns of spying, harassment, assault, direct and also indirect intimidation, and then also attempted kidnapping, assassination, etc., etc. So we are definitely seeing a pattern of replication between all these autocratic regimes, and to understand what kinds of responses and also policies would be the best to be put into place in response to not just the PRC's transnational repression against Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Chinese dissidents. We definitely need to understand what are the similarities between all these transnational repression tactics deployed by also other autocratic regimes as well.
So I believe legislation was recently introduced in the United States Senate to discuss the issue of transnational repression. Joey and Tenzin, since the two of you are based in the US, can you please tell us a little bit more about this bill?
Yeah, I'm not, maybe Joey can explain the bill more, but I'm not all too familiar with it. But I was at the CECC hearing in DC a couple weeks ago, and we had a couple of great panelists, including Thendor, who spoke about recommendations. He had requested Congress and the administration to set up a hotline where people can sort of report incidents of transnational repression by Beijing. And so the congressman was able to respond and said that is actually something that they've been setting up. And so that's really great news. And we just kind of want to make sure that they're taking it as seriously and understanding that everyone who is submitting these reports are at great risk and of being targeted by Beijing's apparatus of transnational repression. And so that was what I wanted to mention about that.
Sure. So adding on to what Yangzom has mentioned, so in regards to legislative efforts introduced by the United States Congress, so Earlier this year, Virginia Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner wrote to the Attorney General of Virginia and then also the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, urging stronger actions from the administration, the executive branch, to deter the PRC's transnational repression against Uyghur-American families here in Virginia. And they have named specifically the cases of Rishan Abbas and then also Nuri Turko. They have named their case and urged stronger actions and also response from the administration. And very early and very recently, earlier this month on March 16th, we also saw that a coalition of bipartisan senators, including Senator Jeff Merkley, Marco Rubio, Ben Cardin, and more, they have co-introduced the Transnational Repression Policy Act. So basically, the act aims to establish U.S. policy in holding foreign governments, namely the PRC, accountable to act as transnational repression against individuals here in the United States. And that includes both individuals who are seeking refuge here, and then, of course, U.S. citizens in the country and U.S. citizens overseas. And they also made it very clear that they, through the legislation, they also wanted to ensure that the Interpol mechanism, which was mentioned by Zumretay, that has been exploited by not just the PRC, but then also a lot of other autocratic regimes that they wanted to ensure that the mechanism will no longer be exploited by these autocratic regimes to target or extradite dissidents, including Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hongkongers, and then also, of course, other pro-democracy dissidents who face the long arms of autocratic regimes elsewhere. So that is basically the fundamental aim of the legislation. And aside from that, we are also seeing a lot of legislative efforts coming from different parts of the legislative branch here in the United States. We saw that the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, which was fairly recently established, they have been organizing hearings and also public events, shining a light on the increasing transnational repression here in the United States. We're also seeing a continuous effort from the Congressional Executive Committee on China. They have been continuously soliciting and then also documenting testimonials and then also evidence presented by different civil society organizations and actors in regards to transnational repression cases happening on the American soil.
Yeah, and just to add on to that as well, I think one of the really most shocking and alarming things that came out within the last year was actually a Tibetan New York Police Department officer who was spying for the Chinese government and using, the power of his position and ranks to manipulate the leaders of our community here in New York. And I think that was kind of one of the reasons why we saw in real time, what was happening in our communities, how much power they were wielding. And I think that has a lot to do with kind of tracing back money and figuring out how exactly China's government is funding institutions, whether it be police stations that we've seen and heard a lot about, the overseas police stations. We all know about the Confucius Institutes and how they are funded entirely by Hanban and the education system in a part of the CCP. And so these are all, these are things that we know, but I think we have to be able to put things together, especially within across all of our communities. It's not just a Tibetan issue. This police officer is a Tibetan issue and solely a Tibetan issue. It's, this police officer could have been an Uyghur person. They could have been a Hong Konger. They could have been a Chinese person infiltrating their communities. And so the police officer did have a lot of interactions with our community leaders here, our NGOs here, and overall can have a really lasting impact on what kind of work the communities are doing and trying to depoliticize our movements. I think that adds to why the bill was introduced and so important here, at least in the U.S.
In addition to legislation or creating a hotline or creating safe reporting mechanisms, what do you think democratic governments and concerned global citizens should do in response to best protect human rights and counter such transnational repression? This question's for all of you, whoever would like to share first.
Yeah, I think the issue of transnational repression has not been talked about enough. I think I think some governments and some stakeholders are starting to understand what it really is and what it means to our communities living in exile, and how it can impact us in these countries. And I think they've started to realize that it has bigger consequences beyond our community, because this also has an impact, and it's directly related to the country's security priorities, to their domestic affairs, because a country, a sovereign country, is interfering in another sovereign country's internal affairs by spying on their citizens, by trying to threaten them. So I think this issue is now on slowly being put on the global agenda, but I think the first thing to do is to listen to the community, communities that are affected by this practice, what they need, what kind of support they need, what are some of the things that they're facing, and really to I think understand the issue entirely, to understand how they're expected to help in this matter, and the resources that they can make available to these communities. So I think these three aspects have to be talked about, and this is something that we always recommend when we meet with governments. Is they have to take action. They someone, I think Tenzin mentioned the hotline. This is something that's very concrete that governments can do, because one of the I think one of the most common frustrations that people in our communities have faced or have felt is when they have they have been threatened by a government agent, directly or indirectly, or they've faced hostage diplomacy or something. They just don't know where to go. They don't know who to call. And if you look at a lot of the interviews, of the Uyghurs, who have lived that experience, they just always said the same thing, which is we don't bother calling the police because they don't know, like they won't help, and they don't know how to help. So I think really to first for the government itself to understand this issue, but also the different government agencies. So down to the police, down to the local authorities, to understand what it really means and all of the direct and indirect consequences that it can have on our communities.
Yeah, I can go next. I think it's important to note that we as our communities don't have the millions of dollars that China has to use against us. We just have ourselves and our work, and so as Zumretay was saying, it's so important to listen to the impacted community members, whether it be the concentration camp survivors that I've met, the human rights defenders like Golok Jigme and Naung Sender, who've all experienced such brutal and heinous things inside prison walls inside Tibet and East Turkestan. They're actually the people who have continued to nonstop protest every day, every night. We had a protest in DC, and we needed people to sleep over, and the first people who volunteered were actually two concentration camp survivors based in Virginia, based in DC, who said, I will be here. I will stay as long as you guys want me to. They're the people. We have Naung Sangdala from Massachusetts, who goes to Tibet Lobby Day every year just so she can talk to congressmen and congresswomen and our representatives about the horrible abuses that she has endured. And so these are the people's stories we have to listen to and amplify. And I think it's been over 24 years now that Tibetans have been experiencing forms of transnational repression. Even just myself being born in India and exile and raised in the US, I've never seen Tibet, and I don't think I will in this lifetime until Tibet is free. And this is probably the case for most Tibetan Americans. And I know this because I have friends who have applied for countless visas to go to Tibet, whether it be through the universities, through so many different channels, but they've all been rejected, or they've gone once in their life, and then since they've come back and been semi-active, they've not been able to go back to visit their families anymore. And so we know that they're imprisoning Uyghurs and Hongkongese and Tibetans to the point where they don't know when they'll ever see anything past a prison cell. And so everyone is so scared of the Chinese government, implications that they can have on themselves, their families, their countries. And it's unfortunately they're unable to see the bigger picture. But it started somewhere. It started with Tibetans and Uyghurs and Chinese people themselves and Hong Kongers. And I wonder sometimes what other proof is the rest of the world waiting on before they start to act.
Yeah, I 100% echo to what Yangzom and Zumretay have mentioned. I think it's really important that we really need to encourage governments, democracies, and then also other stakeholders in the society to really understand and then also to document the scope and also the seriousness of the PRC transnational repression against our communities. As I have mentioned before, whenever we talk about transnational repression against our community, our community members, very often we will be dismissed and be told that the repression against us, the harassment, the attacks against us are not that serious, and that it is not to a point where it deserves government attention or legislative attention yet. So to that, we really need to understand that it is not just a random sort of dispute that we're talking about. What we are talking about right now is that we are facing the transnational repression from a very, very wealthy and powerful regime, that they are orchestrating all of these very sophisticated, comprehensive scheme against our communities that involves so many stakeholders, including not just the state affiliated or the state controlled ones, but then also the coerced individuals, organizations that are taking advantages or money from the Chinese Party, from the PRC government, and making use of their social status, making use of their connections, their networks, and then their influences in this community, in this society, against our community members. So I think first and foremost, we really need to establish the fundamental and then also understanding in regards to the scope and then also the seriousness of the PRC's repression against our communities. And then secondly, as Zumretay have mentioned, rightfully, we really need to establish dedicated units, departments, and then also task forces to tackle the cases of transnational repression. Because as all of us have mentioned, this is not just a random singular attack or harassment against one single community member. It is a sophisticated, organized, and very well thought scheme that involves so many stakeholders against our communities as a whole. It was not just one or two high-profile pro-democracy activists that is being targeted under this transnational repression scheme. It was all of our community members who are currently in exile, who are pro-democracy, who are not even very, very politically active, that are targeted under this scheme. So we really need a dedicated task force and dedicated resources to help us tackle the issue right now that we are facing through means of law enforcement, through means of public education, and through means of legislative efforts. And I think last but not least, we also need to ensure that we are providing sufficient legal protection to victims under transnational repression. For so long, we have been hearing our community members say to us that we have been experiencing the PRC's repression against us, but then we are too afraid to report, first of all, because we know that it might not really receive the attention that it deserves from the governmental departments, from the law enforcement. And secondly, because a lot of these community members are currently here in the United States or elsewhere in other democracies without a permanent legal status, and that because they do not want to put themselves at the risk of being deported back to China, to other CCP controlled regions, that they decided to just ignore and not to report these cases to law enforcement and other governmental organizations and so on and so forth. So I think to make sure that these victims are ensured and guaranteed a permanent status in these democracies is very, very crucial as the first step to bringing attention to the issue.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Tenzin. Thank you, Zumretay. That's all the time we have for today. But before we wrap up, I wanted to give you guys the space and time to share if you have any final messages or any final call to actions that you'd like to share with all of us tuning in today.
Yeah, I can go first. I also just wanted to bring up the reports that have come out recently against Tibetans and Uyghurs and the mass forced DNA collection. I think this is sort of the new frontier of repression that is happening, where they're able to, again, we mentioned a lot today in today's discussion about family mapping and figuring out who's related to who and kind of having that wager over what we're doing actively in exile. And I think that is a really alarming new tactic that the Chinese government is kind of displaying and using Tibetans and Uyghurs and Chinese people as guinea pigs in their massive experiment. And there are companies that are complicit in this that include U.S. companies like Thermo Fisher, and I think that's important to realize, like, what partners are working alongside the CCP, whether they're being, whether they're being complicit or being ignorant. It's still them aiding and abetting in the genocide of our people. But at the end of the day, we all know that the Chinese government will never win the battle for the hearts and minds of the Tibetan, Uyghur, and Hong Kong people, and that we cannot let them take away from the fact that the CCP lacks legitimacy in ruling our people, our nation, and that our communities are all linked, and those, for as long as those inside continue to resist, so will we, and we'll continue to amplify their voices and stand in solidarity with them.
I 100% agree with Yangzom as well. And I think one thing that I would like to, in terms of like best practice, I think one thing is clear is that silence is not a protection. And I would really encourage anyone experiencing any forms of transnational repression to come forward. It can be done anonymously if there are real consequences and fears. But I think silence cannot be a protection. And I think we have experienced this a lot in the Uyghur community where people have just ignored this or didn't report it. But I think even if it doesn't actually lead to anything concrete, it is important that it enters the record. So it is there written as a written concrete evidence, because then that contributes to the documentation efforts, that contributes to the raising awareness efforts. And this also applies at the UN if you are, facing these forms by any authoritarian countries, authoritarian governments at the UN specifically. There are avenues that are available to civil society organizations and activists who are experiencing some sort of retaliation at the UN. There are avenues available to them to report it to the relevant bodies and action to be taken. So I think I would really encourage anyone to really come forward anonymously or publicly.
I fully echo to what Zumretay have mentioned in regards to the fact that silence is not going to protect us from the CCP's long arms and not going to protect us from their transnational repression in our own host countries. And I think we have talked about how these autocratic regimes, including the CCP and so many others like Belarus, Russia, and also many other regimes, including like Iran, etc., are collaborating with each other, are learning from each other, and replicating all these tactics of transnational repression against opposition voices, not just here in the States, in Canada, in UK, but also in places like Taiwan and so many other countries. So I think it's really important that we come forward, we put our experiences, our experiences into the records, and that we come forward and make use of these experiences to push for our government to continue to unite bipartisan efforts in our own countries from the different branches of our governments, and then also to take into account advice and then also suggestions from different civil society actors, and especially those who have experienced the PRC and other regimes' transnational repressions firsthand, to formulate a more extensive whole of government approach, and then also to collaborate with multilateral partners, including democracies, including international organizations, to tackle the PRC's very sophisticated scheme of repression, and also to ensure that in the future, international mechanisms, for example, including the Interpol mechanism, is not going to be exploited as a tool for the PRC and other autocratic regimes to further exercise their repression against our diaspora community members and dissidents in exile.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I learned so much this conversation, and I'm sure our audience did too. For everyone tuning here today, HRF will be adapting this conversation in the coming weeks to be an episode in our Dissidents and Dictators podcast series, which is available to all listeners via Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. So you will be able to listen to this again and refer back to the tools and knowledge that we learned today from Joey, Tenzin, and Zumretay. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to learn more, please follow HRF. Please follow all of our speakers here today, as well as their respective organizations, Students for Free Tibet, that is SFT. Their handle is at SFTHQ. Please also follow World Uyghur Congress. Their Twitter handle is at Uyghur Congress. Once again, thank you all so much. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny and HRF.